Trespassers, a tribute to Benny Rothman and all fighters for the freedom to roam, by Malc Cowle, narrated by the author. Book 2, Connie Gartside's Triumph, Part 2, Chapter 9. Rosie and Connie sat at the kitchen table, engrossed in a game of draughts, when the two men and the boy entered the kitchen. Connie's face lit up in a smile on seeing Mikey, as if the sun had suddenly emerged from behind a particularly thick, dark cloud. "Mikey Grimsditch, you look as frozen as an icicle," Elsie exclaimed. "Come here, lad, and get yourself by this fire." She gave a final poke to the coals and stood up. "What on earth have you been up to? You're shivering and turning blue." "I'm okay, Mrs. Gartside. Never mind you're okay. Just do as you're told for once." The lad sank down on his knees, holding his hands out towards the flames, now leaping halfway up the chimney. Titch rose from his own comfortable position on the flock mat and licked the lad's cheek in greeting. "Get off, you daft dog," Mikey retorted, although there was now a sparkle in his eyes, a sparkle, moreover, that was not the result of the bright fire or recent tears. Jed already had the kettle on, and Jack was adding tea to the large teapot. Elsie busied herself digging out crockery from the dresser. "Would you like some parking, Mikey?" she asked. "I'll get it, Mum." Connie swung round on her chair and leapt into action. At least, that was her intention. Instead, much to everybody's surprise, she took a dive and ended up full length on the floor on her side. Mikey was across to her and kneeling down beside her before anybody else had recovered, apart from Titch, who was marginally ahead. "Are you all right, Con?" She gazed up at him, a frown on her brow. "I think so," she said quietly, obviously subdued by the unexpected accident. "Let me help you sit up." He put an arm around her neck somewhat gingerly. She nodded and smiled, and then placed both arms around his neck in turn, pulling with her full weight as if attempting to lift herself. Caught off balance, Mikey fell on top of her, all in a heap. "My hero," Connie laughed, kissing the end of his nose. Eventually, they both sat up, but not until the young girl had followed up her advantage by kissing the lad once more, this time full on the mouth. She emerged from the tangle with a big grin on her impish little face. Mikey's visage, in its turn, had turned as bright red as Connie's carroty hair. The girl looked at their rather amazed audience. "I've never done that before," she announced. "I forgot I'd taken my leg off." "Lucky Mikey," Rosie said out loud, much to everybody's amusement. "Hello, Pearl. We've got your Mikey with us. Is it all right if he stays for a meal?" "No, don't be daft, with plenty. We always leave the main meal till late on a Sunday." "No, of course it's no trouble. I'll make sure he gets home safe." "Okay, Pearl. Are you working tomorrow as usual?" "Okay. I'll call in and see you." "Okay, love. Bye." Elsie replaced the phone and turned, a smile on her face. "Right, that's all arranged. Now, why don't you kids go outside? It'll be dark soon, so make the most of it. I reckon the snow will have melted by tomorrow." She began to turn away and changed her mind. "Fix Mikey up with a pair of gloves, a hat and a scarf, Connie. We don't want him getting hypothermia." "You can have first go on the sledge, Mikey," Ralph informed him. "No, Ralph," Connie said firmly, passing gloves, woolly hat and scarf to the lad. "He can sit behind me the first time. I don't want him getting hurt." "You must be joking, Connie Gartside," Mikey exclaimed. "I'll take my chances on my own. Thank you very much." "Very sensible," Rosie agreed. The phone rang and Jed answered it. "Gartside Farm, Jed speaking." "Yes, of course. Just let me check." He put his hand over the receiver. "The Go Booze. Can you do bed and breakfast again, Elsie?" "Yes, I suppose so. But tell them I can't manage an evening meal, apart from a snack for supper." There, now we need some small pieces of coal for the eyes and mouth and a carrot for the nose. Rosie had just placed the 12-inch diameter snowball on top of the two much larger ones, thus completing the main structure of the snowman she and the two boys had carefully constructed. "I'll sort it," Ralph said, turning towards the gap in the dry stone wall, which would take him into the adjoining field, and from there into the farmyard. "Whee!" He turned at the sound of Connie's long-drawn-out, delighted squeal, just in time to see her hurtling down the hillside, leaning back on the sledge, her feet braced against the front bar. She was heading straight for the newly constructed figure at great speed. "No, Connie!" he shouted in serious alarm, knowing that the large compressed snowball he and Mikey had carefully rolled was fairly solid and would in effect be an immovable object. To his amazement, Connie evidently had grasped this scientific truth too, because, just as the sledge was about to hit, she rolled off the fast-moving vehicle into the soft snow lying thick in the field, as expertly as if she'd been doing it all her life. The sledge, however, hit the intended target with great force, and, much to Rosie's annoyance, the whole structure shuddered and the head fell off. She turned to give her friend a piece of her mind, only to discover that the younger girl remained sat in the snow, her clothes covered in the white stuff from top to toe, laughing uncontrollably. Ralph ran over, looking down at his youngest and favourite sister, shaking his head, partly in disbelief, partly in fear she had hurt herself, and partly in sheer astonishment at her audacity. He leant forward, holding his hands out to help her stand. "You're so crazy, Connie, it's unbelievable." She took his hands in hers and swung herself upright. "It's all your fault, Ralph," she reported gleefully. "You always insisted there was nothing I couldn't do if I put my mind to it." Meanwhile, both Rosie and Mikey were each rolling a snowball, ready to ambush their friends. However, before they could do so, 2 more snowballs came whizzing through the air, one landing at their feet and the other hitting Ralph on the back. All 4 teenagers turned to see who their mysterious assailants were. There was no sign of a soul in sight. "Must be kids hiding behind the wall," Connie said, bending down for a supply of snow. Ralph followed her lead, and then all 4 were charging down the hill towards the field below, Titch yelping at their heels, as excited as they were. Grandad and Jed suddenly appeared from behind the wall, armed with a fresh supply, and the kids found themselves being bombarded once more, but this time the 2 adults had 6 snowballs each. Undaunted, the children instinctively fanned out, and, realizing they'd been outmaneuvered, the 2 men fled towards the farmhouse and safety. The kids finally caught them in the yard, and before Jed and Jack could open the kitchen door, 4 snowballs hit home. The snowball battle now began in earnest, and only ended when the 2 adults held their hands up in abject surrender. Elsie looked round in surprise, as 2 allegedly sensible adults, 4 fun-loving youngsters and a Manchester Terrier, invaded her domain, all laughing fit to burst, with the sole exception of Titch, who yelped and leapt up at them all in obvious delight. Connie Gartside's Triumph, Chapter 10. Rather luckily, perhaps, the Gorbooths returned to the farm they had decided to make their rural retreat shortly after the Gartsides and their friends had finished their dinner. Mr. Gorbooth knocked on the kitchen door, and Ralph bid them enter. "Would you like a cup of tea?" he asked. "I'm just about to put the kettle on." "That's a very welcome offer," Mr. Gorbooth retorted. "Yes, we would. Thank you for asking." Jack stood up, pulling out the vacant chair from under the table next to his own. "Would you like to take a seat, Mrs. Gorbooth?" he asked with a smile. "No, thank you," the lady responded rather haughtily. "I will take tea in the living room. Will you join me, Robert?" Rosie thought the latter remark sounded more like a command than a question. "I'll be along shortly, my dear." His partner in crime departed. Connie followed. The fire would need a poke and a fresh supply of coal. "Sit down, Mr. Gorbooth," Ralph stated. "You might as well rest your legs whilst I make the brew." The gentleman smiled, removed his fawn-coloured overcoat and draped it over the back of the chair Jack was still standing by. "Let me introduce yous, Mr. Gorbooth," Jack said. "Mrs. Gartside you've already met. This is our host, Mr. Gartside. This is my granddaughter, Rosie Ackroyd. This is young Mikey Grimsditch, a very talented young woodworker. Ralph's making your tea, and I'm Jack O'Donnell." The gentleman nodded to each in turn. "I'm pleased to meet you all," he said rather grandly, taking the proffered seat. Silence reigned for a moment, everybody seemingly lost for words. Then young Mikey suddenly came to life. He produced a small rectangular, thin wooden box out of his pocket. "Have you got a thatcher?" he asked Mr. Gorbooth. The gentleman's eyes narrowed as a frown crossed his brow. Elsie, Jack and Jed looked equally surprised. Ralph, waiting by the sink for the kettle to boil, smiled to himself. Rosie looked on in anticipation. "A thatcher?" "He means a pound coin," Rosie informed him. "Yes, I believe I have." He pulled a small purse out of his jacket inside pocket and retrieved a coin. "Would you like me to change it for you?" "In which way?" "This box is magic," he informed their guest. "It has the power to change pound coins into smaller, more convenient denominations, which I find very handy when shopkeepers are short of change." Now the youngster had his audience hooped. All, including Ralph, gazed at him, wondering what he meant. All except Rosie, that is. Mr. Gorbooth was no exception. He extended the hand, holding out the coin across the table towards the youngster. Mikey, in his turn, pulled out a drawer in the box and extended his hand, the box in its palm, towards the other. "Place the thatcher into the round slot, please," he instructed. The gentleman did so, and Mikey slowly pushed the drawer back into the box. "Now," he said softly, passing the palm of his hand over the top of his other and the box it held, "we have successfully made the thatcher disappear." He smiled, removed his top hand sideways to reveal the box again, which he then held out towards Mr. Gorbooth once more. He slowly pulled out the drawer. "Please extend your hand, palm up, Mr. Gorbooth." Again the gentleman obeyed, and the lad slowly tilted the box towards the awaiting palm, revealing a new coin in the slot previously occupied by the thatcher. It dropped into Mr. Gorbooth's hand, a shiny, copper-coloured new penny. The adult laughed out loud. "How did you do that?" he asked, showing the coin to everybody. "Like I said, it's a magic box." "But where's the rest of my change?" Mikey laughed in his turn. "There isn't any. Like I said, it changes a thatcher into a lower denomination. It's a magic box, not an automatic safe full of loads of coins." "But you said you found it very convenient when shopkeepers had no change." "Yes, I did, and I do," Mikey informed him triumphantly. "I offer to change their pound coins and transform each one they give me into a penny." He looked his victim in the eye. "Trouble is, I rarely get away with it more than once." "Good lad, Mikey. A perfect example of laissez-faire capitalism," Jack O'Donnell pointed out. "An enterprising twist on the old entrepreneur's adage, buy cheap and sell dear." Mr. Gorbooth, realizing he'd been had, gazed at the youngster for a long moment, seemingly nonplussed and lost for words. "Why did you call the pound coin a thatcher?" he asked eventually. "Because it's hard and brassy and thinks it's a sovereign," Rosie exclaimed triumphantly. The door to the living room opened and Connie emerged. A shrill voice followed in her wake. "Robert? Are you avoiding me?" "Just a moment, dear." He rolled his eyes and stood up. "Here's your pound back," Mikey said, his hand held out. Mr. Gorbooth smiled and shook his head. "You keep it, Mikey, my boy. You deserve it. That was a revelation, in more ways than one. Very entertaining, yes indeed. Good evening, all." He made a bow and left the kitchen. Ralph followed with a tray of tea things and a steaming pot. Rosie, no longer able to contain her mirth, burst into a fit of giggles. Connie sat down next to Mikey, looking at Rosie as she did so. "What's got into you, Rosie?" Rosie looked at Mikey and burst into another giggling fit. Ralph returned. "Can I see your box?" he asked the younger boy. Mikey handed it over and Ralph examined it closely, turning it this way and that, finally removing the drawer, which he then slid back inside. "Where did you get it from, Mikey?" "They sell similar ones made in China, I think, at the outdoor gear shop in Hathersage. My mate's got one, but I made that myself after I figured out how his worked. They're really made to make a coin disappear and then appear again. I kind of adapted the idea." "You made it?" Ralph's voice expressed his surprise. "It's a work of art, Mikey. I've never seen such fine joints." Jack took it out of Ralph's hand, examined it carefully, and then passed it on to Jed, obviously impressed. Jed in turn passed it on to Elsie, whispering something in her ear. Rosie, who had examined it earlier, smiled and looked across to Ralph. "We'll need a good woodworker if we're going to have a successful sledge-making business, and with 3 of us involved, we can form a workers' cooperative." "Hang on, what about me?" Connie interjected. Rosie shook her head. "Sorry, Connie, we can only involve skilled workers. Plus, we need people we know can work as part of a creative team." Connie frowned. Rosie had the sudden feeling her friend's temperature was rising rapidly, and she was about to raise a head of steam and thus blow her top. Ralph no doubt felt the same. "We could take on an apprentice, perhaps," he interjected. "They're the ones that spend the first 5 years watching the others, fetching and carrying, holding their tools and stuff and brewing up, aren't they?" Mikey asked. Rosie laughed. "See if I care. I'll start my own workers' thingamajig," Connie retorted sharply. Mikey found Rosie's laughter infectious and joined in, but then he glanced up at the grandfather clock. "I'd better be off," he said. "It's getting late." "Okay, Mikey," Elsie smiled, "but come back soon. Ralph will walk home with you." "And me," Connie interjected. "And me," Rosie added. Titch was already waiting by the door. "Take those gloves and the hat and scarf. They're yours now," Elsie instructed. "And take care on the road. It will be icy, no doubt." As it happened, the thaw had already begun. "Well, that sorted your dilemma out," Rosie said to Connie as they left the Grimsditches and began their return up Kinder Road. "What do you mean?" "Your fantastic dive. It solved the problem of telling Mikey how much you love him." Connie smiled, threaded her arm through Rosie's and hugged it close to her side. Then she frowned and stopped in her tracks. "I didn't do it on purpose. It was an accident." Rosie chuckled. "I'm sure it was. Even you are not that talented, and you wouldn't choose a bare stone floor to do it on anyway. But you seized your opportunity, didn't you? I saw you kiss him." "Well, you're only jealous. You've yet to sort Ralph out." Rosie didn't rise to the bait, determined to keep Ralph's kiss in the workshop a secret. Instead, she said, "I think with your talents, you should seriously consider going into films when you leave school." "Films? I don't think I'd make a very glamorous actress." "Don't put yourself down, Connie Gartside. I think you're quite beautiful, but I really meant as a stunt woman. Come on, you two, don't dawdle. Ralph was a good 10 yards in front of them. They hurried to catch him up, giggling as they went. There won't be any snow left by morning at this rate. Just listen to the drips from the trees. It's melting fast. That means the downfall could be quite spectacular tomorrow, Connie said. Especially if we get a strong southwesterly wind, Ralph concurred. Why? Rosie asked, somewhat puzzled. 4 different streams come together at the top of the downfall, Rosie, all collecting water from different areas of the Scout. The melting snow will give the downfall real force, but when you have a strong southwesterly, it creates an updraft and blows the waterfall back high into the air in a fine spray. It then falls back onto the Scout and finds its way into the streams again to feed the waterfall once more. Oh, Rosie said. So it keeps feeding itself in a continuous cycle. Yes, more or less. Wow, I'd like to see that. Connie Gartside's Triumph, Chapter 11. Come on, Rosie, time to get dressed. Rosie peeped from underneath her duvet. Connie was already dressed, leaning on the sill, peering out of the bedroom window intently. The wind was whistling in the eaves, and the old tree outside their bedroom window was creaking as if ready to break. The snow had completely disappeared. No, I'm on holiday, and I'm staying put. She turned over, wrapping her duvet firmly around her body in the process, seeking to make herself immune from any invasion her friend might be planning. Please yourself, but you're missing the downfall uprising. Rosie unravelled herself from her warm, soft body armour and was out of bed like a shot. Much to her astonishment, a great spray of what looked like water vapour was rising in a massive cloud high in the air above the gritstone edge of the Scout. But what really grabbed her attention was the fact that the lower point of this moving tower of spume began round about halfway down the waterfall's 98-foot drop. Wow, how amazing! I wonder if Grandad's seen it. He must have. The number of years he's been coming to Kinder, Connie pointed out. Anyway, get dressed and you'll soon find out. He's probably tugging into breakfast right now. With that, she made her way out of the room and down the stairs. Rosie continued to gaze out of the window, taking in the spectacle the natural phenomena provided as it unfolded in front of her eyes. A yelp from Titch attracted her attention, and then Ralph was walking across the yard. He opened the door to his workshop and disappeared inside. The girl smiled to herself and resolved to get dressed and join the family below. By the time she emerged into the kitchen, Connie was helping her mother prepare breakfast, having assured her that Rosie would be hungry. This was to be expected, but the male figure sat at the kitchen table, reading the Farmer's Weekly and sipping a cup of tea, was a surprise. Evidently, Mr. Gorebooth had decided to slum it. "Morning," Rosie said to nobody in particular. The greeting was returned by the other 3 occupants of the room. In particular, the gentleman looked up from the paper and said, "And how are you, young lady, this blustery morning?" Rosie smiled her sweetest smile. "Fine, Mr. Gorebooth. Have you seen the downfall?" He looked at her, somewhat puzzled by the question. "The downfall?" "Oh, I forgot. Your bedroom looks over the clough. You must see it. The waterfall's blowing back upwards. It's quite a sight. Come into the yard." Overcome by her enthusiasm, he followed in her wake and made his way to the dry stone wall. "Isn't it wonderful? Have you ever seen anything like that before?" She looked up at him, her long dark hair blowing wildly in the wind, her bright blue eyes shining beneath thick black eyebrows. He remained silent for a moment, looking upwards to Kinder. Finally, he turned to her and smiled. "Quite remarkable. I've never seen anything quite so wild and beautiful in my life." "I love it up here," Rosie responded. "Nature always has some surprise in store, whatever the season. I wish Mum could be here." "Where is she?" "Back in Stockport at work, winning wages so she and I can live. She's a single parent." She looked at him once more. "Did you hear the Prime Minister's speech on Friday? Evidently, I'm one of those feral children destined to become a scrounger or a leech on society at best." She shook her head and laughed. "And I thought I was going to be an engineer." "Are we going to make a start on a new sledge today?" Ralph looked up through the steaming vapour of his cup of tea at Rosie and shook his head. "I need more materials. There's an engineer's supplies warehouse on the edge of New Mills that has all kinds of odds and ends, but I need more cash. Anyway, we need to collect wood for the bonfire tomorrow." Grandad looked at his granddaughter. "What's this about, Rosie?" "Didn't I tell you, Grandad? Ralph and me, and hopefully Mikey, are going to manufacture sledges and maybe other stuff. Trouble is, we need some thingamabob. Oh, you know, what do you call it, Grandad?" Jack O'Donnell seemed completely mystified. "Working capital, that's it," Rosie exclaimed, remembering her lessons in basic capitalist economy. "We need working capital to get us off the ground. I'm going to have to save up all my pocket money. Without raw materials, we can't make anything." "I've got 76 pence, Connie divulged somewhat hopefully, remembering the rebuff she'd received the night before. Grandad's eyes narrowed and he looked thoughtful. "Where are you going to carry out this work?" "Ralph's got a wonderful workshop. Do you want to see it?" Grandad grunted and began to rise from his seat at the table. "Why not, lass? Put your coat on. It's not over warm out there." "I'll come with you," Ralph said. "Me too," Connie added, determined not to be left out, whatever the others might think. Once suitably clothed, they trooped out of the kitchen, and Ralph opened the door to his workshop, leant around the door jamb, and switched on the light. "After you, Mr. O'Donnell." Jack entered the brightly illuminated room. Rosie joined him as he took in the neat layout of the workshop and its contents. "This really does have possibilities. Very impressive, Ralph." "Where's the sledge?" Rosie's tone of voice signalled her alarm. "We left it behind above the field last night," Connie pointed out. "I'll go and get it," she volunteered, eager to be useful and thereby gain a foothold and hopefully become part of the creative team her friend evidently envisaged. She set off outdoors, Rosie following her, along with an excited Titch. Jack O'Donnell continued to examine the workshop. He went over to the oxyacetylene equipment, inspecting the pressure gauges, the blowback arresters on the twin hoses, and the brazing torch minutely, before returning to the workbench. He picked up a metal fabrication, consisting of 2 pieces of tubular steel, braced together in the form of a T. One of Ralph's test pieces, he supposed. Ralph remained silent, watching the way Jack minutely inspected the bronze-welded joint. The older man looked up at the board on which Ralph had mounted his tools. He selected a small square and placed it against the T-piece, holding it up to the light from the small window. He returned the square to its place on the board. "How did you mitre the tube?" he finally asked the lad. "By hand, with a 1-inch half-round file." "How did you ensure its accuracy? You need a tight fit for a good joint. My eye and daylight, in the same way you checked whether it was a right angle or not." Jack smiled. "What's the tolerance for a good brazed joint?" 0.003 of an inch. But if you hold the component parts to the light, even a 1/1000 gap will allow light through, and you can see the gap quite clearly." Jack nodded, his mind going back to the days when he was a toolmaker's apprentice and had first learnt the skill of low-temperature brazing, or silver soldering as it is more commonly known, although it is not really soldering in the accepted sense. "Where does our Rosie come into this?" "She wants me to teach her to braze and bronze weld. She's told me she can silver solder and mitre joints. She says she wants to be an engineer. It was her idea to start a business." Jack nodded. "Yes," he said quietly. "She's wanted to be an engineer ever since she was knee-high to a grasshopper." He put his hand on Ralph's shoulder, gripping it slightly for a brief moment. "I'll tell you something else, Ralph. One way or the other, our Rosie will become an engineer. You can bet your life on that. She can be as determined as that little sister of yours when she sets her mind on something." He chuckled before adding, "And I reckon you're the one to teach her the art of brazing. I'm getting too old for the job." At that point they heard the giggle of girls, and the sound of metal sliding and scraping over gravel and gritstone flags. They left the workshop to see the two youngsters dragging the sledge across the yard. "Look at the bronze welding on this, Grandad," Rosie enthused. "I've seen enough, lass." Much to her astonishment and profound disappointment, he headed towards the kitchen door, and then disappeared inside without another word. Rosie managed to get out. "Have you upset him, Ralph?" Ralph laughed. "I don't think so." After breakfast, Mikey Grimsditch joined the other children, and they spent the rest of the day scouring the farm and the countryside roundabout for anything that would burn, dragging it in great bundles down the lane to the old quarry, the only break in their activity being a short respite for a quick lunch. A horde of kids and a few adults from the immediate area were doing the same, and thus, by that evening, a sizable bonfire had been erected ready for the festivities the following night. Elsie Gartside had visited Pearl Grimsditch that morning, as she'd promised. Mikey's mother now worked in the accounts department of the local cooperative society. As a consequence of their conversation over a cup of tea, Elsie had invited Pearl to share their evening meal, and to assist her in making treacle toffee and more parking for November the 5th, an invite the younger woman had accepted with enthusiasm. Mr. Robert Gore Booth had finally persuaded his partner to go for a drive in the White Peak, promising his lover a visit to Chatsworth on the way back. This decision hadn't been easy. He knew the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire personally, and it would be rather inconvenient if they met. Nonetheless, his lady-love had set her mind on visiting, and he finally decided there was little chance of meeting the landowner, he being unlikely to frequent Chatsworth's cafeteria. Having no great love of the countryside, she'd been slightly upset when he'd informed her he'd extended their stay at the farm for another 3 days. He finally persuaded her by means of a bribe or two, a day out on a shopping expedition in Manchester city centre, and a trip to fashionable Knutsford and Tatton Park in Cheshire. She claimed to be a woman with simple needs. Robert knew better. Edwina had many appetites, some of which could not be discussed in polite company, and were confined to the boudoir in the main. She had a penchant for fashionable clothes, expensive lingerie and underwear, combined with a burning desire for government office. Connie Gartside's Triumph, Chapter 12. Tuesday morning dawned. The sky was overcast and grey with the texture and colour of week-old porridge, as Rosie was to later describe it to Connie. The younger girl wouldn't bother asking a friend when she'd ever seen porridge that had been left untouched for a week, suspecting, not without good reason, she wouldn't receive a sensible answer. For once Rosie was out of bed and dressed first, Her spirits were buoyant, so much so that she'd escaped downstairs without the other girl's knowledge, and careful to keep it that way. Eventually she re-entered the room, 2 steaming cups of tea in her hands. Connie remained fast asleep, her carroty red hair spread over her pillow in a fan of gleaming bright red gold. "Wakey, wakey, here's a brew." She placed her friend's drink on the bedside table, careful not to knock over the artificial limb stood upright next to it, and then shook her exposed shoulder gently with her freed hand. Connie gave out a soft groan and turned, blinking her green feline eyes in the early morning daylight. "There's a cup of tea for you." Rosie sat down on her own bed, watching her best friend slowly coming back to life. "Thanks," she eventually sighed. "I'll let it cool down for a moment." Jack O'Donnell emerged from Ralph's workshop with a list in his hand and retreated into the farmhouse. Elsie informed him there was tea in the pot. He nodded but didn't speak. He sat down at the kitchen table with her and perused his list thoughtfully before extracting a pen from his inside pocket and adding to it. He looked up at last, obviously satisfied with his work. "May I use your phone, Elsie?" She nodded her agreement, and he rose and walked across the room to make his call, looking at the old grandfather clock as he did so. It was coming up to 8:10. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Rosie Ackroyd, Connie and Ralph Gartside, and Mikey Grimsditch left the farm and began a short walk down Colwell Clough, accompanied by Jack O'Donnell and Titch. Grandad had informed Rosie and the others they were going to the Sportsman to meet a friend of his, who would no doubt prove helpful to them. Approaching the pub, Rosie's eyes lit up. She ran forward, Titch at her heels. A tandem leant against the pub wall, with bulging pannier bags front and rear. A collection of aluminium cooking equipment, a small kettle and a zig bottle for paraffin hung from the rear panniers. A green bag, which she knew contained a mountain tent, together with 2 rolled carry mats, were strapped across the top of the bags. The others soon joined her. Ralph began to examine the tandem frame in detail. It was stove-enamelled a plain black, but the lugs were fancy with diamond cutouts and ornate, delicately filed fleur-de-lis picked out in gold. The head badge comprised a white oval, with a narrow red border outlined in black. This outer oval sported gold letters proclaiming "Hand-built frame sets, Manchester." The centre of the badge portrayed the black silhouette of a swift, soaring on outstretched wings, with the maker's signature above it, and the slogan, "Swift and True," beneath it. "Is Tom with Malc, Grandad?" "I expect so. Where else would he be?" "Who's Tom?" Connie asked. Rosie smiled. "He's about 10, and he's another feral child, doomed to become a villain like your Mikey and me. His dad's a bicycle frame builder, and another single parent. We used to live near them in Levenshulme." She led the way into the pub, looking round for her friends. They were nowhere to be seen. She turned to tell her grandfather, puzzled only to discover he'd remained outside with the others. "Hiya, Rosie." She swung round and laughed. "Trust you to be hiding in an alcove near the door, Tom, ready for a quick getaway, no doubt." The boy and his dad laughed. The latter stood up. "Where's your grandad, Rosie? Do you want something to drink?" "He's with my friends admiring your tandem. Could I have orange squash, please, with tap water? No ice." At that point the rest entered, and Rosie went to grab a seat next to Tom. "Long time no see, little one," she said. Tom smiled. It was a long time since Rosie had called him little one. She used to babysit him. "How are you, Rosie?" "Great," she responded. "Oh, this is my friend Connie, and her boyfriend Mikey." Connie grinned and Mikey blushed. "Come on, you two, sit down. This is my friend Tom. He won't bite." "Is it hard?" Connie asked, looking into the young boy's hazel eyes as she sat opposite him. "What?" he asked, looking puzzled. "Peddling the tandem." He leant forward as if to let her into a confidence. "Don't tell me Dad, will you, Connie? I just sit there in the toe clips and let my feet go round, giving out a few grunts when we're struggling uphill. Dad does all the work." Rosie laughed. "Don't be a fibber, Tom Cowle. Do you think I could have a go?" "Ask me, Dad. I'm sure it'll take you for a spin, Connie." He looked across to the bar. Mr. O'Donnell, a youth, and his father seemed deep in conversation whilst they waited to be served. "Best leave it till tomorrow. He'll soon be on his second pint. It takes a great deal of skill to steer the bike from the back when he's had a skinful. I've been on that tandem since my 4th birthday, and I'm only just getting the hang of it." Connie grinned. She was beginning to like this youngster. "What brought you up here, Tom?" Rosie suddenly asked. "Your granddad. He phoned Dad this morning. We're going to camp over the road." "No, you mustn't," Connie intervened. "You can camp in our paddock free of charge, and then you can eat with us as well." Initially, Tom had been a little miffed when his father had said they were riding out to Hayfield and would be camping for a few days. Not that he wasn't used to camping in cold weather, or dislike riding on the tandem, far from it. He loved cycling and camping. The fly in the ointment was the fact that Manchester City Council had organised a bonfire and fireworks spectacular in a local park that self-same evening, and he'd been looking forward to it for weeks. Now, however, he was glad they had come. Rosie's friends were brilliant company and made a great deal of fuss over him, not least because he was the youngest, as had Mr. and Mrs. Gartside. The fact they were camping on the farm was an added bonus. Mrs. Gartside had refused his father's offer of payment, and wouldn't be contradicted. His father was always a bit strapped for cash, but Tom knew that any cut in camping fees would give him the opportunity to insist on his fair share of the money saved. And, to add icing to the cake, the bonfire and fireworks in the quarry proved to be brilliant. Moreover, he was convinced the proceedings were far superior to that enjoyed by his schoolmates back in Burnage, where he now lived. He snuggled up in his sleeping bag that night, a happy and contented lad, wondering what delights the next day would bring. Perhaps Dad would take him to Edale. They camped there at least once a year, and he had friends in the village his own age. "What do you think of young Tom?" Connie looked across to a friend who was already tucked up beneath her duvet. She finally had her leg off and placed it by the side of the bed. She swung the stump and her left leg onto the bed, pulling the duvet over her body in the process. "He's really nice. He's got an amazing sense of humour." Rosie laughed. "He has to have to cope with his dad, I expect." Connie frowned. "What's wrong with his dad?" "Nothing, but he's not your average kind of man." "How do you mean?" "Well, he's brought Tom up more or less on his own since the lad was 22 months old, and he's brought him up on the back of a bike, first in a child's seat on a normal race bike, and then, when Tom was coming up to 4, he built a tandem. When Tom was 5, they cycled from Manchester to the Isle of Skye and back in the school holidays, camping on the way." "The Isle of Skye? That's Scotland, isn't it?" "Yes, off the west coast and way beyond Glasgow. I'll show you on the map tomorrow. It's miles and miles away. They've cycled all over the place. They spent the last summer holidays cycling round Ireland for 5 weeks. His dad's taking me to New Mills on it tomorrow." "New Mills?" "Yes. Your granddad's asked him to pick up the tubing for another 2 sledges, and when I asked if I could have a go on the tandem, he said I could go with him. I know where the warehouse is." "Did you tell him about your leg?" "No, but what's my leg to do with it?" "Have you ever ridden a bike?" "No. Ralph's got an old one in the barn, but it's too big for me." "I think you'd better tell Malc. Cycling's quite different from walking. Your leg's moving with a circular motion when you're cycling." but the top half of my leg and my knee joints are completely normal. But your foot and your ankle aren't. You need to tell him." Connie frowned. "All right, but I'm sure it will be fine." She leant over to switch off the table lamp. "Sleep tight. Watch the bugs don't bite." Connie Gartside's Triumph, Chapter 13. "Just let me move the tandem away from the wall, Connie, and then you can get on. I need to make sure the satellite is right for you." Connie placed her left leg in the toe clip on the left-hand pedal and swung her right leg over the saddle and sat down. She attempted to place her right shoe in the right-hand toe clip, but was having trouble. The pedal kept rotating as soon as the shoe made contact. Malc took hold of the back of what he presumed was her ankle to assist her. He looked up at her in surprise. "You've an artificial leg." "Yes, I meant to tell you." She gazed at him with her bright green eyes, afraid he'd refuse to take her. However, although he shook his head, he placed the shoe in the toe clip and tightened the strap slightly. "Is the ankle articulated?" "Yes, and it's spring-loaded." He nodded his understanding. "The question is it articulated enough? Pedal backwards, Connie, but do it slowly. Stop if you feel any problem." He watched carefully as she did as he asked, completing 2 revolutions. "Okay, that seems fine. Can you dismount safely? I need to take the saddle up slightly." She was off the bike quick as a flash and watched him release the saddle clamp, raise the saddle post 1/4 of an inch, and then reclamp it. "That should do it, Connie. We'll give it a try round the yard, and then we'll be off. But if you feel the slightest discomfort, you must tell me." She smiled. "I will, I promise." All this time he'd been holding the bike upright by holding the front saddle with his right hand, leaving his left hand free to assist her. He now grasped it with his left hand, facing forwards. Much to Connie's surprise, he suddenly lifted his left leg and swung it over the handlebars, lifting the limb as high as any showgirl on the stage. Now straddling the tandem's top tube, with his hands firmly on the handlebars, he placed his left foot in the toe clip, pressed forward on the crank, simultaneously lifting his body to sit on the saddle. His right foot found its place in the toe clip as they began to move forward. She squealed as they circled the yard, but before she knew it, he'd made his way round the cow byre and came to a halt by the gate next to the Bentley. "Oh, I forgot to tell you, Connie, it's your job to open and close gates." She laughed as she dismounted, feeling more excited than she'd felt in a long time. "What do you want to do, Tom, now you've been dispossessed of transport?" "I was hoping to go to Edale. I don't know now." "We could walk there." "Walk?" Rosie laughed. "You've got a good pair of legs. You can't have forgotten how to use them." "But it's miles to Edale." "Don't be daft. It's not that far. We can go over by Edale Cross." He looked across the table at her for quite a long moment. "Do you know the way?" he finally asked. "Of course. I've walked there many times." Another long silence. "Okay, but don't walk too fast." "Right, go and get your windproof, and I'll let Mrs. Gartside know where we're off to." "This is wonderful." "What did you say, Connie?" "This is wonderful," she repeated, raising her voice. "How fast are we going?" "Not fast. Almost 20 miles an hour." They were speeding down the Kinder Road towards the village, seemingly without any effort. They seemed to have been freewheeling for ages. As soon as they entered the village, Malc slowed the tandem down to negotiate the narrow streets. They were soon at the junction with the main road to Glossop. "Turn right and then left," Connie informed him. Malc shook his head. "No, I need to do some shopping for food first. I'll head towards Newtown and turn right in the main shopping street in New Mills. Then we'll come back on the top road after we've picked up the tubing." Connie realised it made sense and quickly agreed. At first their route was fairly flat, but they soon built up speed again, the sheer momentum of the tandem taking them over the small rises they came across. Malc informed her they were cruising at 22 miles an hour. Eventually they reached the long straight downhill stretch that led them into New Mills, and Connie began to understand just how fast a tandem could move. By the time they were nearing the valley bottom, they were travelling at over 45 miles an hour, and much to Connie's joy, had overtaken 2 cars. Then the brakes were being applied. Malc looked quickly over his shoulder to check the road behind was clear, signalled right with his arm outstretched, and moved to the centre of the road before stopping at the T-junction. A couple of cars passed, then the road was clear, and soon they were climbing the hill to the right, eventually coming to a halt outside the co-op. "You get off first, Connie, and then I'll shove it against the wall." She did as asked, and then volunteered to guard it whilst he did his shopping. "What do you think so far, Connie?" "Brilliant, it really is. I want a bike of my own now." He smiled, obviously pleased with her reaction. "I won't be long. See you in a couple of minutes." He disappeared into the store. The girl didn't have to wait too long before he emerged with a carrier bag full of food. "Is there anything you need whilst we're here, Connie?" "No, I just want to get back on the tandem." He stuffed the food in the left-hand pannier bag, asking, "Have you ever cycled before?" as he did so. "No." "Well, you must be a natural. You make a good tandem stoker. I could really feel the difference when we were riding up the hill." She remained silent, but his praise had found its mark. She felt a warm glow inside. "Right, Connie, I'll get on first this time, then you climb aboard, but I'm not going too far. I'm in need of a cup of coffee." "There's a nice cafe up the road at the junction with the road to Marple." "Good choice, Connie, I know it well." "How's your mum, Tom?" "She's okay. She's got a new job working for the Victorian Society, but she was really upset when Dad dropped me off on Friday night." "Why?" "Bloody John Major." "Tom, you shouldn't swear." "Dad says John Major's enough to make a parson swear." Rosie laughed in response, but then looked thoughtful. "My mum was upset by what he said as well. Trouble is, Major thinks everybody has the chance to live in some kind of ideal family. He hasn't a clue how people really live and how they have to cope to survive." He looked at her for a moment, knowing only too well the terrible circumstances that had deprived Rosie of her father. "I'm lucky," he said. "I know Mum and Dad love me. The fact they can't live together's a shame, but they've never let it affect me. I've got friends who live in so-called normal families, and their parents are constantly rowing. I couldn't stand that. I've never known my parents argue." Rosie looked at him in surprise. "I've heard your dad argue." Tom laughed. "Only about religion or politics. I meant I've never known Mum and Dad have an argument about me, and they've never been nasty to each other, as far as I know." "Grandad says your dad loves an argument. He reckons he could start a row in an empty paper bag." Tom laughed again. They were sat on a grassy bank above a stream, near the old Packhorse Bridge at the bottom of Jacob's Ladder. Eventually Rosie stood up. "We'd better make a move. By the time we get to Edale, it will be time to go home." Tom nodded his agreement. "Once we're through Barber Booth, we can walk up the road to Edale village." "Isn't there a footpath, Rosie?" "Yes, but the road will be easier and quicker." "How did you lose your leg, Connie?" There it was, the inevitable question she didn't like being asked. "A motorcyclist hit me, but it wasn't really his fault. He spotted me on the road and put his brakes on to slow down, but he skidded on loose gravel and went over on his side. His front wheel just slid into my leg and took a big lump out of it." She looked him in the eye, steeling herself against the look of pity she hated so much. Instead, much to her surprise, he just shrugged. "Life's a struggle and then we die," he said, with a wry smile. "The important thing is to make sure we make the best of it whilst we can." "Exactly. That's what Ralph always said. Pick yourself up, dust yourself down, and start all over again." "Good for you, Connie. Come on, we've work to do and miles to ride." "Mal?" "Yes?" "Do you know why Ralph and Rosie want this stuff we're picking up?" Yes, to make sledges. Ralph showed me his workshop last night. Are you going to help them? They seem to know what they're doing without my help. Ralph's obviously good at brazing, and he's got tube bending equipment and all the other tools he needs. But there's not much of a future in building sledges, is there? It's a very brief season for snow. Well, yes, you're right, but he can use the same skills and equipment to manufacture all kinds of things. Like bike frames. Is that what you mean? Well, yes, that's a possibility. Would you be willing to teach him? She interrupted herself. No, I don't mean that. What I mean is, would you be willing to teach me? A newfound friend frowned, obviously caught off balance. He took a long sip of coffee. Why do you want to learn? He eventually asked. I want to be useful. I want to be part of their team, and I want to build myself a bike. It's not easy work, Connie. Mitering bike tubing cuts your hands to ribbons. He showed her his fingers and the palms of his hands. His right palm in particular was a mass of fine cuts and scars. It's dirty work. You get covered in carbon from the oxyacetylene and filings from the steel. It gets in your hair and on your clothes and up your nose and in your mouth, unless you wear a mask. I don't mind hard work, and I don't mind muck. I'm a farmer's daughter. We delve in muck day in and day out. He smiled, realizing from the vehemence of her tone she was serious. Okay, he finally said. If you're willing to work at it, I'll give you all the help I can. She nodded. I'm deadly serious. I have to prove I can do it. So, how was your day? Just let me get my leg off and I'll tell you. Rosie sat up in bed, her back propped up by a pile of pillows. There, Connie grinned, making her own way under her duvet. She gazed across at her friend. It was the best day ever. Malc's really nice. After we brought the tubing back, we went for a ride. We went to Whaley Bridge and then to Chapel-on-Frith and climbed up Rushhope Edge. We whizzed down Winnett's Pass to Castleton, and then went to Hope and up through Edale and over Mamnick, and then we whizzed down Rushhope Edge and overtook 3 cars. You should have seen the drivers' faces. He told me I'm a really good tandem stoker, but best of all, he's going to teach me the art of building bike frames. In fact, he's going to teach me how to measure people up and build frames tailored to their particular size and their individual requirements, like making a made-to-measure suit. I'm going to build myself a bike. He's going to provide me with some Reynolds 531 tubing, and it'll be so light I'll be able to lift the frame with one finger. She finally paused for breath. Rosie stared in disbelief, her bright blue eyes open wide. You don't have to look like that, Rosie Ackroyd. If you and Ralph are lucky, I might be able to provide you with work when your customers for sledges melt away with the spring sunshine. Connie Gartside's Trial, Chapter 14. When the 2 girls entered the kitchen for breakfast the next morning, they were not surprised to find Malc and Tom at the table, along with Ralph, Grandad, and Elsie. They were surprised to discover that Mikey was with them. Grandad looked up. Ah, there you are. We've been waiting for you too. What's going on? Rosie asked. Has something exciting happened? Connie echoed. As your financial backer, I've decided to call a business meeting. The 2 girls exchanged glances and took their places at the table. At that point, Mr. Gore Booth entered. Morning, everybody, he greeted them. Is there any chance of a cup of tea? I'll make it, Rosie volunteered. We were just about to begin a business meeting, Grandad said, rather pointedly. A business meeting? Yes. These children and Ralph are embarking on a business venture. Surely they are rather young to commence a business. Grandad shook his head. Although young Rosie, Connie and Mikey here are still at school, it's important they think of their future. The days are long gone when a youngster could leave school and walk into a job. Thanks to Thatcherism and the disastrous neoliberal idea that the country can rely on banking, the financial and service sectors to pay its way, the engineering industries and manufacturing generally have collapsed. Industrial capitalism isn't working, is it, Mr. Gorbooth? What are today's unemployment figures? 2.5 million officially, Malc intervened sharply. Probably nearer 3 in reality and still growing. Aye, the Tories are good at fiddling their boots. Mr. Gorbooth did not rise to the bait, but he did ask if he could observe the proceedings, and it was agreed, in the form of a round of nods, that he could. Rosie produced his tea and took her seat next to him. Now then, to sum up where we stand, our Rosie wants to be an engineer, and has done so for a long time. Ralph has already learnt how to braze and bronze weld, and, having had some experience in that field myself, I can assure you he's good at it. He's attending a night school course in mechanical engineering. He has a workshop and the tools he requires, and has already made a prototype sledge, which I understand young Connie has subjected to a number of severe tests, although she's failed to damage it. Mikey is a keen and, I must say, highly skilled woodworker. Rosie and Ralph want to start a business making sledges, and they want Mikey to work with them. Is that what you want, Mikey? Yes. Right. Now, I've put up the cash for enough materials for 2 more sledges. Once you've sold them, you're on your own. You'll have to buy more materials with whatever money you make. Work at it when you can. Make a success of it, and none of you will have to search for work when you finish school. Do you understand? Ralph, Rosie and Mikey nodded. Connie remained noticeably silent. Ralph looked across at her. She returned his look, but still remained silent. Her face was a mask, giving no hint of her feelings at being left out of Jack's final summing up. Ralph frowned, wondering what was going on in her mind. Normally, Connie's face was as expressive as a boot. Finally, he said, I think we should involve Connie. Her face broke into a smile at long last, much to Ralph's relief. Unfortunately, Connie soon wiped the smile off his face. I may not be available. I've arranged a course of instruction, she pronounced gravely, looking at Malc for a brief moment, as a result of which he gave her a quick smile of encouragement. A course of instruction in the art and science of bicycle frame design and construction. Once I'm qualified, I may be able to subcontract the brazing work to you, providing your work is up to my exacting standards. Everybody, with the sole exception of the frame builder, looked at her in astonishment, including Rosie, who had been given a prior warning but hadn't taken it seriously. I never thought you'd turn out to be a selfish capitalist, Rosie responded. Fancy you wanting to exploit other people's labour. That's a bit unfair, Rosie, her grandfather intervened. Isn't your business going to be a capitalist enterprise? No, it's not, and you of all people know it's not. We've agreed to form a workers' cooperative. We'll employ ourselves using our own capital, and we'll all share equally in the results of our own labour. Grandad smiled. Ralph backed Rosie up. Yes, we've agreed our enterprise will be under democratic management and control. If you want to be involved, you can be, little sister, but we are not subcontracting our labour to you or anybody else. Our workshop will be a capitalist-free zone. We are all free labourers. We have no intention of becoming anybody's wage slaves. Does that mean you'll take turns brewing up and doing all the basic work, like keeping the place clean, the fetching and carrying and labouring generally? Of course, and we'll train each other to do each other's jobs. So if somebody's ill or on holiday or something, there will always be one of us to fill in for them. And will you consider making other things besides sledges? Of course, we're not daft. We've already agreed to make walking sticks like the ones I made for you and Rosie. Mikey will be really good at that, and there's a big market for them. Right, Connie said with a grin. I will consider your offer. and let you know my decision when I've had chance to consult my business advisor." "Would you like to go for a ride this morning, Connie?" Malc asked. "I fancy visiting Buxton." Tom looked at his dad in disgust. He hadn't bargained on a walking holiday. Mr. Gore sipped his tea quietly and somewhat thoughtfully. "What are your thoughts on the meeting you've just witnessed, Mr. Gore?" Elsie asked. The children and Ralph had left the kitchen for the workshop, leaving the adults alone. "Quite remarkable," the gentleman responded. "I've never come across a set of children quite like them, so self-confident, and each and every one so polite and well-behaved, and yet full of fun and all so lively. I had a chance to talk to that young lad Tom this morning. I was admiring the tandem. He told me with great pride that you'd made it, Mr. Cowle, and he related some of the adventures you've shared. It's hard to believe he's only just turned 10 years of age. He has a remarkable vocabulary for one so young." Malc remained silent. "Can I ask you how you became a bicycle frame builder? It's an unusual occupation." Malc shook his head with a wry smile. "Necessity is the mother of invention." The gentleman seemed to be puzzled, but before he could pursue the question further, Jack intervened. "I know Malc well. He served his time as an engineering apprentice. He completed his time as a draftsman, a creative job he loved. He was an active trade unionist, and eventually became interested in politics. He joined the Communist Party. A lethal combination, that, being an active trade unionist and a communist. From that point on, he was a marked man. He found himself blacklisted by the Engineering Employers Federation and the Shipbuilders and Repairers National Association, simply because he had the temerity to help to defend and advance the conditions of his fellows. Unable to obtain work in the trade he took great pride in, unwilling to accept a future of life on the dole, and with young Tom about to appear on the scene, he reinvented himself as a bicycle frame builder. Me and thousands more over the decades, Malc pointed out. Good job we live in a free country. The gentleman, whose father was a captain of industry, was about to respond when Elsie decided to put in her twopenn'orth. "I'm no expert on politics, but I don't think any of the children are particularly remarkable at all, Mr. Gore. They are perfectly normal children. They all come from different backgrounds, but they do have important things in common." A guest looked at her, somewhat surprised. Elsie smiled once more. "Rosie, Tom and Mikey are all being brought up by a single parent. None of their parents planned to be single parents, but that is the way things have turned out. None of the parents have had an easy time, but they all got on with it. More importantly, all the children, just like our Ralph and Connie, know they are loved and have stability in their lives. It is my belief that love and stability are probably the two most important factors children need if they are to flourish, and I've yet to find a single person who can prove otherwise. The 4 family units are quite different from each other, but they're all focused on the well-being of the kids. They and I know the children are our future. They and thousands like them are this country's future. They and their parents, single or otherwise, deserve better than the cheap, hypocritical jibes and threats the present government are trumpeting." Malc smiled. "I agree with Elsie," he stated quietly. "You can take that message back to your friend John Major, Mr. Blackwell, isn't it? Mr. Blackwell, MP. Tell him to forget Victorian family values. Victorian family life was no picnic. Any student of the Industrial Revolution knows that for working people in our part of the world, it was virtually impossible to have any family life. Husbands, wives and children had to work in the mill 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for a subsistence wage. As for the middle and upper classes, their family life wasn't up to much either, was it? Childcare was never an upper-class forte. Didn't the mothers put their children's breastfeeding out to a wet nurse, and their childcare in the hands of maids and governesses? As soon as the boys were 7, didn't they send them away to preparatory school, and then to public school? In fact, isn't that what happened to you in the 20th century, Mr. Blackwell? The wives and daughters were their husbands' and fathers' chattels. The former were often seduced by their husbands' business competitors, and the daughters were all too often bartered into marriage in order to cement business, financial and political alliances. Love and marriage were two quite different concepts in the Victorian era, weren't they? In short, many examples of middle-class and upper-class marriage were little more than a form of enforced prostitution. You need to remind Major, it is not the role of government to dictate family structures or lecture parents on a subject he clearly has no knowledge of. It's the government's job to assist the development of economic and social conditions in which children can thrive and be encouraged to play a positive role in the society. His predecessor, the saintly Margaret, had the temerity to deny even existed. They need to know they have the right to work when they leave school, and that their parents have the right to leisure and being able to spend time with their children instead of working all the hours God sends in order to eke out a living. At this point, the Right Honourable Robert Blackwell, Member of Parliament and Junior Minister in the John Major government, had had enough. He sported a face resembling that of a little boy caught with his hand in the jar of barley sugars. He realised he had to inform his lady friend and fellow MP, Edwina, that they had been rumbled. He wondered if he should phone his wife and advise Edwina to contact her spouse. Would the story be given to the press? He made his excuses and left the room. "I've a feeling I've lost 2 paying guests," Elsie said with a grin. "How on earth did you know who he was?" Jack O'Donnell asked Malc. "Well, I recognised him for a start, but only after I'd been told his name. I debated with him once at a public meeting when I worked in London for the Communist Party as National Election Agent, although it must have been over 15 years ago. He's changed a lot since then. His hair's disappeared and his paunch has grown. No doubt I've changed too. He obviously didn't remember me." "So, who told you his name?" "Young Connie. She and Elsie were changing the sheets. He left a letter from one of his constituents on the table next to the bed. Connie noticed the name." "That's right," Elsie smiled. "And Milady's not his wife either. Now we know just exactly what the Tories mean by a return to Victorian family values. You should have seen the laundry she'd left all over the floor. Talk about a strumpet, and in my best bedroom too." "Ah well," Malc said. "There's one law for the rich and quite another for the labouring poor, as Disraeli pointed out many decades ago, when Victoria was but a young queen, and he was a bit of a radical." Postscript to Connie Gartside's triumph. When I commenced writing this short story, I didn't know where the characters were going to lead me. I never do. However, the year I set the tale in naturally took me back to my own situation at the time. Like Pilgrim's Ditch and Rosie's mother, Alice Ackroyd, I too was a single parent in November 1991. My son Tom, around whom my life inevitably revolved, had just turned 10, and like Pearl and Alice, I found the message of the then Tory government with regard to the need for a return to Victorian family values both offensive and hypocritical. Not least because in the case of divorced parents like myself, it tended to create unnecessary divisions between the parent with day-to-day care and the so-called absent parent. In 1993, Major compounded his error with his Back to Basics campaign. We have yet to see how the lives of Rosie and Mikey pan out, but I am pleased to report that my son, now aged 30 at the time of writing, is a highly successful website designer and plays a positive role in the society to which he belongs. The fact he has achieved this, despite my rather eccentric methods of childcare and nurture, is in itself proof of the resilience of children, and, without doubt, the positive role in his life played by the absent parent, namely his mother. During the same period, John Major was of course recovering from his 4-year dalliance with Edwina Curry. As for the Blessed Margaret, she remains, as far as I know, the only British Prime Minister to have reared a son who is a convicted international terrorist. So much for Victorian family values. I think I'll stick with my own. Malc Cowle, Manchester, 2012. This audiobook has been brought to you by the Northen Grove Publishing Project in support of the Working Class Movement Library, Salford, M5 4WX. The children's adventures continue in the third and final book in the Trespassers series, namely, The Bicycle Frame Builder's Apprentice.